Well, we're moving through the course. Quick and dirty, Chapter 11, Advertising. Well, let's start with the definition of advertising. Remember, whenever you see something in direct quote marks on my PowerPoints, that is a direct quote from Ralph Hanson's text. So, this is his definition of advertising. It's a form of non-personal communication. So, almost by definition, it's going to a mass audience. About an organization, about a product, about a service, about an idea. Now, Ralph Hanson says by an identified sponsor, but I'm not sure that there always is an identified sponsor. Usually there is, but occasionally with political attack ads and maybe a few other things. You can't quite tell who's behind it. Well, if you're on the chat box, let's get you into it right away. Sure, when you tell me about forms of advertising, I'm sure that you will tell me about the obvious things like television advertising or newspaper advertising, but hopefully we'll get to some really obscure stuff. Let's see what you can do with that. All right, this is our history of advertising segment. Advertising begins to have a place in American society with the process of industrialization in the 19th century. And this is where we in the United States move from an economy where work is generally done by hand. Goods are generally done to order. Going from that to factory assembly lines, mass producing goods. Modernization is the idea of people becoming freed from what at one point would have been their destiny. You know, in the early United States, an agrarian nation, your grandparents were farmers, your parents were farmers, you were going to be a farmer. Modernization is the idea that increasingly people had some capacity to imagine who they would want to be, how they would want to present themselves to the world. The economy of abundance is a term that refers to America in the post-World War II era, that at some point after depression and then war, we wound up with a society that could produce more goods than people could consume. So it wasn't so much a competition of people competing for scarce goods, it was the other way around. The consumer culture in the United States really gets underway in the latter stages of the 19th century, maybe after the Civil War. This is a time when brand names begin to become increasingly important, that they become a sign of not just familiarity, but consistent quality. Some of the early brands you still recognize today, others, well, lost to history. Beginning with Benjamin Day in 1833 with his New York Sun, it became apparent that there was a better business gathering a large audience and selling the audience to the advertisers than there was in trying to sell your media product. I mean, when you think back to the lesson of Benjamin Day and his New York Sun, the paper and ink probably cost more than a penny a day. The purpose of the paper economically was to draw that mass audience that advertisers could appeal to. The large consumer magazines of the 1800s. they were also prime advertising vehicles, the first national advertising vehicle. It is certainly telling, thinking back to the magazine chapter for a moment, that the large general interest magazines began to lose relevance by the 1970s, not so much because people stopped reading them, but because advertisers found a better platform in network television. Certainly, when you think about broadcast radio and broadcast television, ask your grandparents. Did they pay for television before they had cable or satellite? Do they ever pay for the radio? Well, no. They are advertising supported. Here's a quote from Ralph Hanson's book. This is television advertising. So what the TV station or the TV network is in the business to do is to collect not just a large audience, but a large audience that runs to a type. And then you try to find advertisers who want to find that type. I mean, think about if your television show is very strong with women 18 to 49, well, what might be products that could be sold on that show? Let's talk about two types of consumer advertising. Local advertising doesn't particularly care what it is you buy. It only cares about where you buy it. So our example of local advertising on this slide would be Norm's Restaurants. They don't care if you buy a burger or steak and eggs or a fruit cup. Just buy it at Norm's. National advertising doesn't particularly care where you buy the product, just that you buy their product and not a competing product. So our example here is Budweiser, and the ad is, please note, it's just a brand building sort of ad. It would be perfectly content if you bought your Budweiser at 7-Eleven, or if you bought it at the local bar, or you bought it at a sports stadium. Just don't buy Coors or Miller, is what the ad is saying. Consumer advertising typically has two types of appeals. I would say the harder sell message is the direct action message. The direct action message is asking you to do something now. We want you to get up off your couch, and we want you to, call a phone number, or we want you to do something in the near term. For those of you who have been in Speech 101, this is a little similar to the call to action type speech. What's more, the soft sell in consumer advertising is the indirect action message. So, please note with this Coca-Cola ad, it is not particularly asking you to rush out and buy it now. It's not saying, this weekend only we're going to have a blow it out to the bare walls sale on Coca-Cola. It just isn't that sort of thing. Note how it uses this very friendly, comfortable image to associate it with the brand name. Let's get to some other types of advertising other than consumer advertising. Advocacy advertising is there to persuade us. Well, I guess all advertising does, but I mean in this case, persuade us to a point of view. It's please note this is from the World Wildlife Federation, and this ad is not saying, please give to the World Wildlife Federation, although I'm sure they'd be pleased if you did. What they're saying is, we want to sell to you the idea of, hey, don't kill for fur. Now, among those organizations that may engage in advocacy advertising, it could be from the government. It could be from a corporation. It could be from a trade association or a nonprofit. Public service advertising is uh, oftentimes not paid for. For example, if you've ever been on your student newspaper and you're laying out the physical version of the newspaper, and inevitably there'll be some story that won't quite fill out the news columns on that page, and you have that little bit of white space you need to plug up. Well, that's where you get a Red Cross ad or something like that. Public service advertising that is available that you just plug in. Or if you're a little TV station and you do not sell all the advertising space around a certain show, or maybe an advertiser pulls out, well, put in one of those PSAs, one of those public service ads. Public service ads are usually from nonprofit institutions or government agencies, and oftentimes they urge people to do something or not do something. Trade advertising is easily comparable to trade publications, if you remember from the magazine chapter. Trade advertising, also called business-to-business ads, doesn't sell things to the general consumer. It sells things to businesses. So please note, the typical person would not want 24 t-shirts with their name on it. They would probably not need 5,000 business cards. But if you had, a bakery or something like that, this would make perfect sense. So, trade advertising, also known as business-to-business ads. On this slide, I tell you about the components of the advertising business. Well, obviously, with the advertising business, there are clients. Now, please note that in advertising, usually organizations do not have their own in-house advertising department. Advertising is considered to be too much of a creative endeavor to have that same loyal staff churning out ads year after year. Usually, clients look for an ad agency. And what's good about moving from one ad agency to another is that every advertising campaign has a lifespan. No matter how creative it was at the beginning, at some point it starts to grow stale. The viewers, readers, listeners, they begin to tune it out. And at that point, usually a company will look for another advertising agency. Another component of the advertising business are the media where the ads appear. And of course, the media where the ads appear should be a good match for what you're trying to sell. So, for example, if we were a dentist who was perhaps a specialist in false teeth and was in Glendale, the Glendale News Press might be a good place to advertise. On the other hand, if we are urging Hoover and Glendale High School students to go to Glendale College, well, I don't think the Glendale News Press would be quite the place to try to find 17 and 18-year-olds. And of course, the other component of the advertising business are the people receiving the ads, the audience. And of course, the advertiser really should know with great specificity just what demographics they are trying to reach. all ads, and I think all media messages, are targeted. So what I mean by targeting here is that the ad is seeking to put the product or the service or the idea before a specifically defined group of people. Now, targeting is done with demographics. So, demographics, for example, if we are selling Chevy trucks, well, we are selling some trucks to women, but we are probably selling more trucks to men, so that's something to keep in mind. We are probably not selling new Chevy trucks to people who are at the very bottom of the economic spectrum. We are probably not selling Chevy trucks to people who are at the very top of the economic spectrum. We're probably selling them to blue-collar to middle-class people. If we're talking about selling Chevy trucks with geographics, we are probably selling per capita, I mean per 1,000 people, we're probably selling more Chevy trucks in rural Texas than we are in San Francisco. So our geographics may be tilted a little bit more toward Middle America. And then psychographics. Psychographics is what type of person are we trying to reach? How do they think of themselves? Are they traditionalists? Are they free thinkers? Well, look at the image that is being conveyed in this Chevy truck ad. Is this an appeal to traditional Americana? Or does this have a sort of counterculture vibe to it? As society has evolved, so has advertising. For example, gay-themed advertising is far more mainstream than it was even 20 years ago. I mean, take a look at the ad here. This is for Amtrak. I would hardly think of Amtrak as an edgy or daring advertiser. Gay customers are increasingly prized by advertisers because they are perceived as upscale, educated, and what are sometimes called DINK households. That's an acronym. It stands for dual income, no kids. It is a huge market. There are advertisers who began to appeal to the gay market a little bit earlier than others. Absolute Vodka was one. And today, gay targeted ads are mainstream. Clutter. Advertising is an ever-growing business, unless we're in an economic recession. And what that means is economic growth means more ads. And it means more ads crowding the same old places for advertising. And so an ongoing challenge for advertisers is to try to find a place to put their ads where they won't be overwhelmed by other people's ads. This is called breaking through the clutter. And it's an ongoing challenge. Now, for us as the consumer, I think where we notice breaking through the clutter is that you will see an ad in a place where you say, gee, I don't think that used to be a place for advertising. I mean, I'll just give you one example so I can start you going here. Think about those gas pumps in recent years that have the little screens on them. Well, that can be a place for advertising. So you're filling your car up with gas, you're seeing the little weather report on the screen, and you're appreciating that, but then it cuts to an ad, and you say, gosh, I never got a video ad from a gas pump before. Well, that's an advertiser trying to break through the clutter. So, now it's your turn. use the chat box and tell me, where are you seeing ads? In what places are you now beginning to see ads where you don't remember that there used to be ads in that place? Ads try very hard to get your attention. And one way that they do that is to be daring, to be edgy, to be outrageous. There are some parts of the audience that really reward edgy, outrageous humor. Young males come to mind. Now, that's great. But the trouble is, for advertisers, sometimes in trying to be edgy, they sail right over the edge of good taste. And sometimes the advertisers don't realize they have done that until the ad is already out there in circulation. Now, on this slide and the next slide, I'm going to refer to ads. In the notes surrounding this audio PowerPoint, I will leave the web address where you can see each of the ads. So the first one I'm going to talk about here was a 2013 Mountain Dew ad. Clearly, this Mountain Dew ad was meant to have a young male appeal. The creator of the ad was brought in by an ad agency and no doubt was given full run to do something that was edgy and outrageous. But in the report that you will see about this 2013 Mountain Dew ad, the result was fairly disastrous. Now that said, the top advertising people get paid a lot of money for good reason. They are very creative and very talented, and sometimes they hit the grand slam home run, or whatever your metaphor is. I will take you back to early 1984. Apple Computer, as it was called back then, was not just introducing a new line of computer, they were introducing a new type of computer. This is the first Macintosh that you see on this screen. And personal computers, home computers did exist, but the early Macintosh was the first mass-produced computer to have a mouse and use icons. The computer was rolled out in a Super Bowl ad. 1 minute of expensive Super Bowl ad time was purchased. It was an indirect action ad. It wasn't telling the audience, go out and buy a Macintosh this weekend. We'll knock a couple $100 off the price. It wasn't that kind of ad. It was just introducing the product. It was a national ad. It wasn't telling you, if you wish to buy this computer. It wasn't telling you who to buy it from. It was just saying, buy a Macintosh and not some other company's computer. This famous ad established the idea of the event commercial, one that paradoxically becomes famous because it isn't shown very much. Advertising to children has always been controversial. And I think at the root of why it's controversial is that there is a tremendous mismatch between the sophistication of the people making the ads and the target customer of the ads. I also think that advertising to children is controversial because sometimes advertisers advertise things that, when used in excess, can lead to poor health outcomes. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, an organization worth paying attention to. Has said there's strong evidence that junk food ads directed at children are correlated. Now, they're not saying causality. Look at that word correlated. As you will hear from many professors throughout your education, correlation is not causality. But still, these ads are correlated with a lifetime of poor eating patterns and obesity. And as we know about obesity, that can lead to poor health over the long run. It can lead to diabetes. It can lead to high blood pressure and other things that a person is better off without. Subliminal advertising. Students will sometimes throw the term around. They'll say, oh, that ad was certainly subliminal. And I'll wonder, what does the student mean? And generally what the student means is it had some sort of symbolism in it. Well, before we talk about subliminal advertising, I think it's probably a good idea for us all to make sure that we're talking about the same phenomenon. The phenomenon that I'm going to talk about here is it possible to send a message so quickly that a person doesn't consciously know that they have received a message, yet their subconscious, which is much faster, according to this theory, soaks up the message, and the effect is it is almost like a hypnotic suggestion. I mean, is it possible to do that? Well, this idea has been in American culture for a long time. And unlike a lot of unusual ideas somehow make their way into our culture, this one, it's pretty clear where the idea comes from. Vance Packard's classic about advertising, The Hidden Persuaders. One of the highlights of that very influential book was an experiment that was allegedly done at a drive-in in Fort Lee, New Jersey, for 6 weeks during the summer of 1957. According to the chapter in The Hidden Persuaders, audiences saw messages that said, "Eat popcorn, drink Coca-Cola." Now, they didn't know that they had seen those messages because each of those messages were flashed on the screen for 1/1300th of a second. And, okay, I agree. I wouldn't know that I had seen anything if it was flashed at me for 1/1300th of a second. The ethics of the experiment are a little questionable. The audience had no way of knowing that they were being experimented upon. And I guess that would be good for trying to have clean results. But on the other hand, gee, I would like to know when someone's experimenting on me. Well, the results of this famous experiment were stunning. Popcorn sales went up by more than half. Coca-Cola sales went up by almost a fifth. Each of those figures were allegedly well within statistical significance. There is just one problem with this very famous and for many years influential experiment. It appears to be a fake. Among other things, it has never been directly replicated. In scientific method, if you discover something, especially if it's something big and dramatic like this, other researchers should be able to follow your recipe and get the same result. And in over 60 years, nobody else has gotten these results. It's time to move on from this idea of what subliminal advertising is. There is another idea about what subliminal advertising is. It came up about 15 years after that infamous chapter in Vance Packard's book. Dr. Wilson Bryan Key wrote the book Subliminal Seduction in 1972, and he followed it up with 2 sequels. I think it was the first book that was the most influential. And I have to tell you, Dr. Key found a little bit. His theory was that advertisers were putting subtle sexual symbols into print ads, magazine ads, newspaper ads, billboards. He mostly looked at magazine ads. And what he felt that these phallic symbols did was that they riveted the viewer on the ad. Maybe it attracted them to the ad, and they didn't quite know why. And so there would be a behavioral effect when they're at the supermarket or the liquor store or wherever, and they look at the product and they think of that pleasurable sensation. Well, I don't know if this technique really works. Why I think that Dr. Key deserves a little bit of credit is that he was able to show that a few artistic types in the advertising business did come forward in reaction to the book and say, yeah, we put something in that ad. But it was very sporadic. It was just a handful of cases, and it appears to be creative people just being creative. What Dr. Key couldn't quite establish was that this technique, was it widespread, and did it actually sell more product? Let's talk about 2 types of ads that don't really look like ads. Advertorials have been around for a long time. And advertorials are pretty straightforward. It is when a company usually has been caught doing something wrong, and they want to give their side of the story. So they take out ads in major magazines and major newspapers, and there's maybe like a letter from the chief executive officer or something like that, giving the company's side of the story. That would be an advertorial. And advertorials are pretty straightforward in that the people reading them understand that they are ads. Usually any good newspaper or magazine, if they're running an advertorial like ad, they will put some sort of disclaimer on the page. This is a paid advertisement. Native ads are a little bit of a different thing. Native ads are content that you run into on social media for the most part, and it appears to be journalism, but you can't quite figure out from what publication. Or if there is a publication, it's something you never heard of. What makes a native ad is that it's really trying to sell a product, but it's doing it under the guise of pseudo-journalism, fake journalism. Let's talk a little bit about where advertising is going. I think that the traditional half-minute television commercial is not going to go extinct anytime soon, but I think it is going to steadily become less important. It's pretty obvious that our mobile devices that we look at, according to one media note I did a couple of years ago, the average American looks at their smartphone screen about 125 times a day. That is just a robust place for advertising. Product placement type ads, I think, will probably become more prevalent than they are now, especially in television and movies. Video game environments, which are quite sticky, and what that means is people spend a lot of time in their games. That's a very, very good platform for advertising. I think that this is a very good time to advertise very specialized products. Google keywords, for example, is very, very long tail friendly. What you can do is you can have your paid link come up if, let's say, you run a little company that has hand knit dog sweaters or something like that. Anytime someone puts that term into Google, you can pay to have your paid link come up near the top of the screen. Well, that does it for the advertising chapter.